Britishness is under attack. The pool of people coming to your country are from extremist Muslim pockets.
Certain demands being imposed on the wider population to appease certain groups. Essentially, we have this movement now to introduce blasphemy laws in the UK. People will say to this effect now that Islam is not compatible with Western democracy.
You've got imams that are imported. This is like a critical issue. Cultivating a political and social revolution in the country they've immigrated to. And it's okay to be Islamophobic because people are scared of Muslims. Here's the thing, no one wants to say that.
Leftist politicians will imply or infer that actually integration is the responsibility of the native population. How do we integrate people and what do we do about these issues?
Piers Morgan, Douglas Murray, very vocal about the rape gangs, the grooming gangs, and all that other stuff. Where are they for violence against women normally?
Let's talk about the scandal in the Catholic Church. No one would say, but other people abuse kids too.
There's no Muslims speaking out like this in the UK.
And why is that?
Where are these guys?
Just how many grooming gangs have we got in London?
What does she mean by that?
You know full well what I mean by that. It's all over the television. You know exactly what I mean by that.
I'm unclear, Chair, what is meant by the question. If she could spell it out, I can answer.
He's honor bound to step up and step in. He's not doing that because why? If you're transacting violence against women, you're going against the Quran, period. When
they look at how Islam is playing out in their society, they question, well, is Islam the Quran or is Islam what I'm actually seeing in front of my eyes? All right, JT Pinna, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for thinking of me.
No problem. So I was on your podcast, Crossing Faiths, a few months ago, mainly talking about queer theory. We talked a bit about the Olympics as well. So if anyone's interested in that, I will link it in the description. You can go check it out. So JT, I'd kind of like to start a bit about just who you are, your background, and maybe just give an overview on what Crossing Faiths is and what you do with that.
Sure. So I have a 30-year career in national security, working with civil society in the U.S. government. And one of my specialties was faith engagement, so engagement of religious minorities in overseas for national security concerns for the United States. One of the components of my career was this faith engagement and setting up civil society organizations and entities to interact with government and to find out what was the issue-based and constituency-based engagement. So we started the International Religious Freedom Roundtable in 2009 and helped fortify structures to make sure that we could engage with religious minorities internationally, and they would have a say in developing and addressing national security concerns for themselves in the United States. Since I retired, I decided to take a component of that and bring the conversations that I have with sort of people that I interacted with over the 30 years with it to the public space. And Crossing Faiths is a podcast that deals with faith journeys as a third of it, religion and politics by different faith groups talking, and then issue-based or constituency-based issues like our conversation talking about whether or not queer theory is a religion or is like a religion. So that's sort of the bulk of how Crossing Faiths came to be and really who I am.
Thanks so much for that. Yeah, I think what struck me with our conversation is, you mentioned you have a gay daughter, right? Lesbian daughter.
Yes,
Yeah. So I guess what I'd like to focus on today is, I live in London in the UK, and I'm sure things are kind of different in the US than the UK in regards to Islam. We have a higher kind of percentage of our population, I think, and we've had a lot of migration. So, since I've sort of dived into political commentary, there's been a lot of conversation around Islam and its place in society in the UK and Europe, I suppose. But I feel like as well, over the past few years, it's become even a bigger talking point. And, there's been the kind of invention of the independent media, podcasts, sort of allowing certain conversations independently that perhaps were not platformed on mainstream media in recent years. And, I feel very concerned on a number of counts in terms of, what may be happening from, the Islamic side and how that's being dealt with in our country, but also also the real polarization over this debate, and the claim I'm seeing a lot of claims from people saying, there's no moderate form of Islam, like there's no real integration with Islam, people kind of veering really towards the hardline position. So that's a big concern for me, because if we don't address certain issues or have open conversations, then things will become more and more polarized, right? And obviously, speaking to you, we're able to have such an open conversation about so many things. So I don't recognize that, in you, for example. So I thought you'd be such a great person to talk to about it. And I guess, yeah.
No, I appreciate you inviting me over. I mean, I think you're correct. I'm not going to say, I would never say never, but I don't think that someone like Piers Morgan would invite somebody like me onto his show to just speak clearly and with straight lines about the Muslim community. So I'm a smiling Muslim, right? So I'm like Islam After Hours. I'm a small sect of Islam on the Shia side, and we're more of an esoteric sect, but well known through the Ummah, the global Muslim community. So, I always been very careful. I don't speak for Islam. I speak from my heart and from my perspective. But in the same respect, I have a small organization called Muslims for Muslims International, which does about 80% intra-faith engagement, right? So engaging the Ummah globally, and about 20% multi-faith, because multi-faith is very, very healthy. And before that, I used to, for about 7 years, I went all over the world and salated out, or prayed with Muslims all over the world and got their perspectives. And so, I know, Sheikh bin Baya and Sistani and Usmani and all these guys who are floating out there, who are sort of the names in the religious scholars all over the world. And so the challenge is that, not one person speaks for Islam. But when it comes to the news, like you're mentioning, there's just they bring in these people who are first of all, they're on their heels, so they're defending Islam, but they defend it from a very, very narrow band, and so and they don't speak for all of Islam. So if you bring an extremist in to defend Islam, they're going to push back very, very hard, and they, even if their points are valid, they're going to come across as really, really harsh and abrupt, very terse. But even if they're not, but then most of the time, what they're doing is they're not doing. I've watched some of the, Shadid Malik and a couple of, and Sadiq Khan and a few others speak, and they don't speak just calmly and clearly. They don't think about the questions. They have a narrative, slogans that they use, and that doesn't help anything when it comes to intra-faith engagement, right? Engaging outwardly. That's one element. I think a second element is that, when it comes to Muslims, if I go down the street and I go to a corner and I burn down a house, all right, and then it's because I'm Muslim. And it has nothing to do with the fact that we might have been neighbors for years, and we have beef because he's moved his fence across my yard, and started to gobble up, a part of my property, or trashed my car. The history is thrown out, and it's, this guy's Muslim and he did this. Whereas if that same person who I have a beef with comes at me and he's not Muslim and does something with me, it's just an act of violence. And so there's a really strange lens at how things are looked at if you're Muslim. And I think most Muslim, majority Muslims, are very careful on how they act, because they know that they're stewarding the faith as well as just being a person.
Right. Hey, everyone. I hope you are enjoying this interview with JT Pinna. Let me know if your thoughts or opinions on Islam have changed from this conversation. And while you're at it, if you're not subscribed, please hit the subscribe button so you can help my channel reach as many people as possible. And go ahead, hit the like button. You want to. And with that said, let's get back into it. Right. Yeah, well, we can definitely dig into that a bit more when it comes to the perception on crime and everything. So I would say Islam in UK and Europe, and possibly the US, I think there are big differences in the debate, but it's become one of those kind of hot button topics. You can also throw in stuff that we talked about with transgender issues, immigration, there's quite a few sort of what they would deem culture war issues in which it's very difficult for people to, respectfully criticize certain ideas in good faith. So, with Islam and with transgenderism, obviously those two things are in no way the same thing, but there's been lots of people that have, criticized things in quite a civilized way, and then they've suffered harsh repercussions like losing their jobs and, losing, being cancelled, as we say in this kind of culture war thing. And I can see, and so can many people, that it's making the issue worse because it's not allowing us to address, true fundamentalism and extremism, because people are trying to stifle all conversation. But then it's also perhaps, I posit, it's leading to a perception that everything is fundamentalist or extremist because we're not allowed to have these conversations. And
yeah, no, you're right. Well, fundamentalists don't like to get criticized. So I deal with, most of what I deal with is intra-faith, right? So dealing within the faith. And so fundamentalists are the only people in the Muslim community that don't like to be criticized, right? So they're the best and most well-funded organizations. So let's just take out of the four schools, Sunni schools, dominant for Sunni schools. So there's four Shia and four Sunni that are the majority of Islam, and that comes out of the Amman message, which was a meeting of all the scholars in 2004, right? So let's just take one school of jurisprudence, right? And that's the Hanbali. And the Hanbali on the Sunni side, that's where you get your Salafis from. That's where you get Wahhabis from. They don't like to be. You can be a Wahhabi and not be violent. You can be a Salafi and not be violent. But that's where you get this sort of believe in the fundamentals, kind of really believe everybody's wrong, except for them. Mm-hmm. And then the problem is that they're funded by big money, right? So imagine if the Southern Baptists in America, or let's just take you guys like the Anglicans, right? If the Anglicans, which they're the top faith in your community, but imagine if they have big Texas oil money behind them. So private funded money, they could just do whatever they want. So the Slavis and Wahhabis have that because the Saudis fund them, right? So just like on the Shia side, you have the Twelvers, right? The Jafris that are floating around, and that's the largest sect of Shia Islam. And who are they backed by? Well, they're backed by Iran, right? And so and then you have this sort of global Shia community who want to turn the entire globe into Shia. So the problem is those two, right? And both of them essentially are Wahhabis, right? They're very fundamentalist extremists who don't like to be criticized. So on the Muslim side, they just don't like to be criticized. They have very strong sort of narratives, but those are the people generally that the news calls. I mean, you get every once in a while, you get somebody like Reza Aslan or Mustafa Akol, who are two scholars who would be considered sort of moderates. It's strange because the moderates are the majority of Islam. They're, and most Muslims are just trying to put their pants on one leg at a time and go to work and do their thing. But you have these sort of dominant groups that are well funded, and they control the narrative. And I'll give you an example of how this is real. In Washington D.C., so I worked for the American Islamic Congress, which at one time was the only alternate voice for Islam in America. So we're talking not too far ago, like we're talking the early 2000s. It was MPAC, ISNA, CARE, and MPAC, ISNA, CARE, and ISNA. Those were the dominant organizations, Islamic Society of North America, all started by the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, that's not supposition. That's some of them are unindicted co-conspirators of 9/11. I mean, all this stuff is Googleable. And so they were representing Islam. And so the only alternate voice was the American Islamic Congress. And how did that translate into the American Muslim community, right? So 25% of Muslims in America are African American, 32% are South Asian Americans, 18% are Arab Americans. Actually, it was 18% then. It's now somewhere around 15%. And then the rest are sort of others, sort of like, pockets of guys like me. And so the challenge was there was no alternate voice. And for 50 years, the only entities that represented Islam were started by the Muslim Brotherhood. So Muslim Brotherhood doesn't pull triggers, right? They have Al-Qaeda and ISIS to do that, but they're the political combine. And so the challenge is that the U.S. government, for example, would listen to them. And so when we revamped the FBI investigative procedures back in, I think it was 2011, they had it written that if you had the script for Ali, so difference between Sunni, do you know the difference between Sunni and Shia at all? Is this
Not
helpful?
really. You can.
Is this
Yeah,
helpful?
sure. Yeah. I mean, if you want to, if you need to explain it kind of briefly,
It takes
then
3 minutes to do it, maybe a little bit less. But Sunni, so Sunnis are schools of jurisprudence, right? So basically, the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he passed away, there was the group that followed the best friend, Abu Bakr, and there's the group that followed the family line under Ali, right, the son-in-law, and who married the daughter. And those that follow the family line are Shia. Those that follow the schools of the best friend, Abu Bakr, they broke out into 4 schools of jurisprudence. And then the family, on the family side, those that followed Ali broke into basically 4 major schools that followed the family. And so that's the difference between Sunni and Shia. Best friend, son-in-law. That's the break. Okay. So that's where you get sort of sectarian violence and stuff. So the people that follow the family are very passionate about Ali, the son-in-law. And so a lot of people who are driving in the car have a little prayer for Hazrat Ali hanging on their mirror. Right? I don't know if you guys hang things in your mirrors in the UK, but we do a lot. There's a lot of stuff hanging out from people's mirrors in our country.
Right.
In the FBI training materials that were the Muslim Brotherhood, these organizations consulted with the FBI, said, if you see this script for Ali, then they're terrorists, and you should detain them immediately. That was in the FBI training materials. So it speaks to our point, right? So you have these people who are defining Islam, saying they represent Islam, but half of Islam follows the family line and will have like prayers to the family, like you would to a saint. And in their training materials, it was like, arrest this guy if Ali is in there. So imagine if you followed, like, you know, if you had some kind of Anglican group, and they said, like the Anglicans, who their line goes to the king, right? He's the representative. It's not the Pope. Imagine if the Anglicans wrote into the police procedure that if you have something in your car or anything saying that you're into the Pope, you get arrested because you're a threat to the government. It's the same thing, right? So these are the people who are well funded, who have a voice, and who are given a voice by the media. And so the challenge is that that's all you see. And so if you can't jockey yourself into the legacy media, you got to do things like start our own podcasts and stuff like that, and have conversations like this to kind of expose that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
yeah,
so,
I got you. Thanks.
Yeah. So we just went through what is the difference between Sunni and Shia, and then kind of these groups are out there. Now it's very diverse. So you have like Muslims for Progressive Values. You have all kinds of civil society groups that represent the diversity of the Ummah. But a lot of them are fledgling, maybe 5 years old, 10 years old, and they're still sort of hedging up. But they're still the go-to places are these well-funded organizations that are out there, and it's no different in the UK. Although there are some different characteristics of the Muslim community there in the UK because of the colonial history. Yeah.
Hey guys, if you want to support my channel, you can go and subscribe to the Jack Jewell Uncut Substack, where you can see the full, uncut, untamed, and unashamed takes from this episode, as well as bonus footage seen nowhere else. Link is on screen and in the description. Thanks for explaining that. Yeah, my perception, and I don't know how correct it is, would be Islam is possibly better integrated in the US than it is in Europe. So I'll give you a bit of an overview on kind of the general sentiments of the country at the moment, because for a long time, the British people have voted for parties, on manifestos that they would lower immigration because they were concerned that immigration levels were too high. This is kind of all started in 1997 with Tony Blair, who sort of opened the borders and then had this sort of utopian idea of a multicultural society. And then this kind of concept of multiculturalism was born. So, we went from in the 90s having net immigration, so, the number of people coming minus the number of people leaving, in the tens of thousands, which was a manageable level to, sustain for our infrastructure and everything like that. But this has just kind of increased year on year. And it's, largely come from this kind of economic argument of we need to increase our GDP. Companies are asking for these people. We don't have enough people to go into jobs. Meanwhile, the kind of general population is we have 9 million people on the welfare state and not working. So, we're importing a lot of different cultures, a lot of different people in order to sustain business. But, I think it was David Cameron, our prime minister in the early 2010s. He said he thought multiculturalism had failed. And by that, he was talking about, we have kind of done a very mass migration experiment, essentially. There are loads of different cultures coming into our country, many of them outside Europe. And a situation we found ourselves in is actually siloed communities who are sort of living separate lives. In some cases, people don't even speak English. They go to schools where, it's a fairly homogenous group. And people are, have different loyalties and different, there's a lack of this notion of kind of shared British values, if you know what I mean. People have kind of lost sense of what that is. So despite him saying that in 2010, he got elected on a promise to lower immigration. And since then, numbers have just exponentially increased. So in this last year, we've actually had a net migration figure of 1 million people. And every political leader since then has promised to lower immigration, but they've done the exact opposite. So what's happening is people have this growing resentment towards the, what they describe as the political elite, who are perhaps in a certain bubble of privilege, or where they are not necessarily impacted by a culture and demographic changing at such speed. And we have a lot of towns, particularly in the Midlands and the north of England, where it's not as wealthy, where a lot of those people express that they've seen their villages and towns kind of change so rapidly that they don't recognize it anymore. Now, obviously, not all of that is to do with Islam. There's other cultures too, but in particular, since we left the European Union, what we've done is actually we've swapped mass migration from Europe to non-European countries. So, it's a very high majority now of mass migration we're getting from like North Africa and the Middle East and India. So there's just been this growing resentment. But the problem is that these kind of the political class and the liberal elite, people like to call them, so the mainstream media figures, sort of some journalists and politicians, they've betrayed what the voters have asked for. But then in order to kind of control the narrative, it's become increasingly more the effect that they combat criticism behind culture, demographic changing, and different religions increasing in this country by telling people that they are racist and they are far right bigots. And that's happening, more and more. So it's making people even angrier. And in some cases, people are then becoming more radicalized. So I think the problem we're facing is that, with Islam in particular, people feel, in comparison to like Hindus and Sikhs, for example, that there are issues amongst those communities in particular in which they are segregated, they don't integrate with wider society. There are issues with non-English speakers. And what's very interesting is that actually, in terms of kind of radical views and fundamentalism, or views that are very not in line with kind of traditional Western values, such as, equality of genders, issues on homosexuality, how we view that. It's actually the second generation immigrants that are appearing to be the most radical. So there's kind of there's a sentiment that within our mosques, they've actually become possibly more extreme over time, and then our younger generation is somehow more extreme than their parents. So I guess I know that I've said a lot there, but I think people are feeling really, people honestly are feeling quite scared about this change and the fact that it's very, very difficult for anyone to say, we do have an issue with multicultural and integration. And actually, we do want to be able to assert, we want to protect the, native British population and the values that we all love about this country. But, every time people try and do that, there is a Twitter storm. There are politicians saying you're far right, you're racist. And, it is a big concern among communities. And people will say, to this effect now, that Islam is not compatible with Western democracy. So I guess I've said a lot there, but I'm curious to kind of know how you feel.
Yeah, I mean, in the U.S. kind of stays against any one group sort of elevating because we're so big, right? And I mean, we just had, I don't know, some of the numbers of 13 million people came over during the Biden administration, right? Across the border, but not, some of them were Muslim, but a lot of them were from South America. But there's Eastern Europeans, there's Asians, and so forth. So we have a sort of mechanism that, with our size, and that American culture is an integrative sort of idea. So so it's a little bit different for us. Plus, our cities are massive, all right? So that's the other thing, is that we can absorb into our infrastructure quite a bit. I think that those are sort of broad strokes differences. Another difference, if I turn around into the UK, is that we're a lot the Britishness, right? There was a really great, I don't know how you guys have done it, but you guys were this massive colonial power, and then the Commonwealth sort of retreated, right? And now it's largely the UK and these sort of independent entities that were part of the Commonwealth, right? They were plugged in, but it's not an empire anymore. And so the challenge was that if you wanted to be part of the British culture, you wanted to immigrate there, you would go to a British school, you'd have a British accent, right? And you would integrate. And from a perspective of an outsider, it's like everybody just kind of became their oppressor if they were, and I hate using these words, but if they were going to participate in UK culture, right? So they had a British accent, had British education. It didn't matter what they looked like or where they're from. They kind of had to become indigenized to British culture in order to perform and to be successful, right? That's changed though. And so the thing that I've noticed is that, so you have this quality of small towns. I got this passionate conversation about this Brit, and they were talking about all the towns they have. And I go, well, you got London, which is very big, millions of people. But then the next biggest city is what, Manchester? And then maybe Edinburgh?
Birmingham, I think, is, the second.
Birmingham, that's, yeah. But it's not millions in Birmingham. It's like 600,000. 700,000, right? It's not millions, right? And so, like, we have Chicago, we have Los Angeles, we have Las Vegas, we've got New York, we've got Philadelphia, and so these are massive millions of people in each town, let alone state. I think the challenge is that you have London, and it's not noticeable so much in London unless you go like Brick Street, right? And you go there, and then and all of a sudden you're in a completely different land. But that's part of the charm of London, right? But the problem is, if this happens just from a logistical standpoint and from an infrastructure standpoint in something like Birmingham or Manchester or Edinburgh is a little bit different because you got Scots up there. And so, and I'm poking fun at the Scots a little bit. They're their own people. So, but the challenge is these cities are very small in perspective to to America, right? So you're going to notice this big difference. They're coming from, a lot of times, your ex-colonial possessions, and the ex-colonial possessions, and through what we call string immigration, where one person immigrates and then they get the whole family to come in. So the problem is that you're only going to get specific kinds of people if you're going from your ex-colonial possessions, right? And the problem, and you've seen this sort of withering away of indigenizing themselves to British culture, which you guys have done really good at I think up to the last 10 years. And then all of a sudden something changed, and I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I think that the Tories kind of Tories lost.
Yeah.
They lost their leadership. That's one. Two is, I think, any of the leadership of the kingship, the monarchy, queenship. I think that with the aging queen, the engagement dropped, and that culture element sort of tipped a little bit. This is just an outsider's perspective. I'm not sure if these are facts, but this is just from an outsider who's lived for 13 years in the UK and kind of interacted with a lot of collaborative programming. And then the other thing is that there was I think a decline in sort of like cultural anchors, right? So there was a lot of, there was like MP Kamal, right? So Syed Kamal, he's a member of parliament. He was a senior member of the London Parliament. And so he's I think he's knighted. I think he's a sir. And so, but he went to school in Russia. He came to Britain. He's probably like the best of you guys. I'm talking about the sort of like UK Muslims, as well as someone who's understands the breadth and scope of the history and has participated in process, where he became a member of parliament. Well, the problem is that you have this move from participating in process in the UK to, we're now going to change what it means to be English. And as loath as I am to say it, I mean, Douglas Murray is kind of right in this scenario, because he's got this sort of Britishness is under attack. Piers Morgan is right. It's under attack. People are coming, and they're not, in our country, you can have Chinatown, right? And they speak, and they'll speak Chinese there. People that will be in Chinatown have never spoken English. And our culture, society, infrastructure, everybody can accept that, because we're big enough where it doesn't affect things.
Right.
It doesn't affect voting and so forth. But the problem is that you have in these small cities where you have below 1 million people, the voting blocks are going to increase. And these individuals are not integrating. So like they're wearing the niqab, they're wearing, the burqa, the niqab is just seeing the face, right?
Yeah.
And so you'll see all that stuff, and they'll institute a culture change through food diplomacy, right? Food engagement, culture engagement, and so forth. And then you go to you'll go to the Imam Barga, you go to the mosque, and you've got imams that are imported. This is like a critical issue. They're not trained in the UK. They're trained somewhere else. So this is one of those sort of Johnny P controversial views, right? Is that, you need to have homegrown imams. You can't have imams that are from somewhere else coming in and spending time with cultivating a political and social revolution in the country they've immigrated to. And that happens here. I was at a conference, a Shia conference, where they brought in an imam from overseas, and he told everybody to put their phones on the floor. And he said, no one's allowed to go to the bathrooms or do anything. And they said, we're locking the doors, so no one's allowed to leave. And then he started getting to political rhetoric, like anti-American stuff. And like, I stood up with my staff and I was like, what is going on here? And they're like, you can't go anywhere. I was like, you can't restrain me. I was like, I don't know who you think you are. And like, so I grew up Muslim. My great grandparents raised me, my grandparents raised me, and I there was a little bit of a shouting match in Urdu and Farsi, Dari, and I was like, you're not restraining people. I mean, that's, first of all, that in itself is anti-American, but that happens here. Does the government know about it? Probably. The challenge is that, I mean, if I know about it, the government does know about it. But the fact is that that's not unique, and it doesn't have to be at a convention where they bring a speaker in and lock the doors and tell you to put your cell phones down, and they start talking about anti-American rhetoric and talking about building a global Shia revolution. That's common. It happens at the mosque at the Imam Barga, at the mosque level. It does happen, and so the problem is you have a lot of foreign speakers that are coming in who are going to go back home and they're going to, go back to their community and say, we have allies in Birmingham because I just spoke there. When I talk to other imams around the world, and in some of the most liberal places. So you're talking about the UAE, and I talk with a Shia, a Sunni imam there who has a large following, and he goes online and he says, somebody comes to a religious leader and they say, "Can I do this or can I do that or can I do that?" And they tell him what's halal and what's not. My comment always to him is, it's very easy for you because you're in a Muslim majority country. It's a lot more difficult for us here if you're integrated. I'm lucky I was born here, so I have a different perspective of things. But the challenge is that he's telling Muslims here in America from his perspective to not integrate, to don't celebrate, to not walk into a house where someone's celebrating Christmas.
Right.
I mean, so you're sitting there getting advice and guidance from an imam, and they're saying, is it haram if I go? Is it a sin, right? For me to go into my friend's house who's celebrating Christmas, and he's like, it's idolatry. You shouldn't be doing that. It's like, what's easy for him to say because he's living in the UAE.
Yeah.
But the problem is that now you have a group of young people, and this is where we get to your second generation, who are not listening to parents, who are not listening to about integration on the local level, who are online right now, who are listening to someone who's empowered them, who's from a big mosque in the UAE saying, you need to be like this, be rigid, be a jerk. And so the problem is that there's not enough homegrown religious leaders, and it doesn't matter if they're Muslim, but it matters just on a pragmatic scale. There is too much communication with extremists overseas, and I'll give you a really good, and extremism helps generate revenue. So I'll give you a really good example. I have following on LinkedIn. That's the platform I work on, right? Is LinkedIn, and it's professional, but on Facebook, I don't have a following on Facebook. And the reason why I don't have a following on Facebook is because Muslims for Muslims International is not controversial. So when since we've formed in 2016, we have not been able to do a post because Meta won't let us do a post because they say that we're a bot,
right.
a robot, and we're not.
Yeah.
But then if you appeal for that, like you tell them to say, no, I'm not a bot, it goes through a process, and that process always comes back and says you're a bot. And so there's no one to talk to. There's nobody to stop it. I mean, maybe, so there's nobody. So then when I talk to somebody, a friend of mine at Meta, they go, yeah, well, you want to know what? The review committee's here, and you want to know what? These are the people on the review committee. And every time your case comes up, they don't like your organization. And I go, well, who are these people? And they said, well, this is their ethnicity. This is what's going on. This is their fate. And basically, guess who they are? They're Wahhabis. So they're part of the review committee. So I think that I'm trying to address some of the issues from a practical perspective. You've got a very, very large sort of integrated communication system globally, and anybody can tap into and be empowered by extremists. I mean, you guys saw it with ISIS. People were getting recruited to go to ISIS and become all kinds. That's one component. Your cities are very small. That's another component. The other element is that the pool of people coming to your country are from extremist Muslim pockets, right? So it's you got these sort of Middle East, in Pakistan. I have been to Pakistan, traveled that area, worked in that area, worked in the Northern Territories for 3.5 years. You're going to have the groups that are coming are empowered, and they don't listen to anybody domestically in their country. They listen to their zakaras and sheikhs and imams that are back in Karachi or in Lahore or Rawalpindi or whatever. And so they're still listening to that stream of information that's coming. And so imagine you're talking about a place that exists because of the partition. They have blasphemy laws, which are colonial laws. They were established by the British. And the people that are there are living under the same idea. And the diaspora now is mobilized to instill and disrupt, because they see this as not pay. I wouldn't say payback, but they see this as a natural evolution of their social protest against the British Empire and the partition, right? And that's real. Right? It's not something that's a fake. And so that's part of it. The other part of it is something very, very practical. People are comfortable with what they know, right? So Chinatown exists not because the Chinese are like rebelling against the United States. It's because there's a sort of history of persecution, right? But then there's you want to come and you don't necessarily want to indigenize so much. You want to stick with what you know and stay protected with what you know. And so by doing that, it's a disservice to the country that's hosting you.
Yeah. Because
so
it's like it's like a tolerance towards, we're so tolerant that we tolerate intolerance.
Well, you guys are unique. I mean, like I said, I can't remember who it was. It was Constantine. It was I can't remember. He was talking about how many people were arrested in Russia for their online posts. And it was somewhere around 400.
Yeah.
And then in the UK, it was like 3,000. And it was like, what? So, I don't know. I don't understand the calculus of how, of when someone is reporting in the UK of something that is unacceptable. And I was in Ayr, which is in Scotland. It's on the west coast of Scotland, and there was a sign over there that said no antisocial behavior. Right. So from an American perspective, I was like, it was a really funny, goofy sign, But then I go, what's antisocial? Right. So I think the tolerance for antisocial behavior in the UK has always been very low. Right. Because it's Britain. Right. Unless everything is tolerated once you have a few beers, right? So that then you can say whatever you want. But everybody's kind of really, and a good way of kind of sort of showing that is how to when someone from the UK is trying to say goodbye on the phone, you never get off the phone with them because they don't want to hang up. They don't want to end the conversation abruptly or be rude. So everybody says bye, 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 bye. Like everybody kind of goes through that. So I think that there's a cultural element of how to figure out what is intolerable, right? And what is antisocial. And the problem is that when you're dealing with different cultures, a Brit naturally would say, well, we can't not be a good host to the other, right? And that's a very natural, very British sort of the extension of the hand. But translating into law, it being antisocial means you're making me feel uncomfortable, and therefore, if I feel uncomfortable, maybe you're making a lot of people feel uncomfortable. So we need to clamp this down right now.
Yeah.
And it's this sort of, it's got a life of its own now where you have cancel culture, woke, and so forth.
Yes.
And I think that's part of the problem with the British culture exists and is living and vibrant. The challenge is it can't adapt in a way in which it's going to address hurt feelings. And in the UK, that's already a touchy subject because Brits are so straight-laced until you have a few beers with you. You know what I mean? Until you get to the pub. So, and so when it translates into law, it becomes very interpretive. And when it's interpretive, and you have somebody like you have what I would consider, these sort of like do-gooders who don't want anybody to be offended and feel like you can't allow people to be offended, then they're going to err on the side, on a really extremist side, and get people. Get people arrested and tell them to stop, hamper free speech and all this other stuff. So I think there is a break in that system because of the way the culture looks at being a good host.
Yeah.
And it hasn't really adapted. But yeah, I mean, I think that I think I hit some of the high points, but if you want to talk about some specific issues, I'd love to. I think, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think everything.
Did that make sense?
Oh yeah. Perfect sense. I already sort of vaguely knew about some of that, but I think you explained it really well, particularly with what's going on in our mosques, because there's a mosque around the corner from me, but obviously anyone who's not going to those mosques is just completely disconnected. It's all behind closed doors, right? So you just really have no idea. So we talk about this concept of integration, and a lot of our politicians come out with it. To me, it feels like a very nebulous concept, the way they explain it, because they say we need to work on integration, people need to learn English. They say quite basic things, but actually what I hear from them a lot of the time, and what some of the more woke or, leftist politicians will imply or infer, that actually integration is the responsibility of the native population, because we need to be kind, we need to be welcoming, we need to modify our language, and we need to appreciate multiculturalism more so people are allowed to feel welcome. You know, it's the same notion as they say, well, the reason more crime is being committed in certain areas, now this is not specifically Islam, but I'm just using it as an example, is because police are in those areas too much and they're intimidating people. So they kind of, to me, they get the problem completely inverted. And I don't know kind of what your thoughts about integration are, because I'm yet to hear any politician come out and say, this is our policy for integration, this is what we're going to do. And, you know, the way I sort of see it is, if I were to go to the UAE or Singapore or, I don't know, Dubai, I mean, I don't know the specifics, but there are countries that have very, you know, strong rules and social norms. And what Westerners do when they go there is they generally abide by those things, because to do otherwise is not tolerated. So, you know, we say integration like it's this kind of harmonious notion, but what I'm thinking is actually what we lack in our politicians and political class is the political will to have zero tolerance towards extremist behavior, towards certain demands being imposed on the wider population to appease certain groups. I mean, I don't know what you'd think of, because you mentioned the burqa and the niqab. Like, for example, there's no conversation on, well, you know, we welcome Islam, but do we welcome that? Is that something we can talk about? Is that something we want to encourage in our society? We have other issues going on, such as, you know, we've just had 5 new MPs for the first time elected to parliament as independent Muslims that campaign solely on the issue of Gaza. And, you know, it's the first time we've sort of seen sectarian politics playing out, and it's expected to grow. And some of the stuff that's come up in the past few months, one of them, for example, is a conversation around first cousin marriage. And, you know, when a Tory MP suggested we ban first cousin marriage, which is happening a lot in this country, if you look at Parliament, the gasps and the hisses and the sneers when someone suggests this, and most of them are coming from white people. But, you know, right. That one of those MPs...
Your parliament's fun. It's really fun, your parliament. You know, it's you know, just watching what the reactions, you know, it's much more vocal than ours, than our legislator. But yeah, so you're saying that there's gasps from the whites in your parliament about going against first cousin marriage.
Yeah, because they will say we do not want to alienate certain groups. And one of those independent MPs stood up and he argued against outlawing it because he said it would be sensitive to certain communities and harm them.
Forced marriage must be prevented and the freedom of women must be protected at all times. However, the way to redress this is not to empower the state to ban adults from marrying each other, not least because I don't think it would be effective or enforceable. Instead, the matter needs to be approached as a health awareness issue and a cultural issue where women are being forced against their will to undergo marriage. In doing so, it is important to recognize for many people this is a highly sensitive issue, and in discussing it, we should try to step into the shoes of those who perhaps are not from the same culture as ours, to better understand why the practice continues to be so widespread. Instead of stigmatizing those who are in cousin marriages or those inclined to be, a much more positive approach would be to facilitate advanced genetic test screening for prospective married couples, as is the case in all Arab countries in the Persian Gulf.
And I think that same MP also asked a question to the Prime Minister if he would consider introducing a bill to ban desecration of the Quran.
November marks Islamophobia Awareness Month. Last year, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution condemning the desecration of religious texts, including the Quran, despite opposition from the previous government. Acts of such mindless desecration only serve to fuel division and hatred within our society. Will the Prime Minister commit to introducing measures to prohibit the desecration of all religious texts and the prophets of the Abrahamic religions.
Can I agree with him that desecration is awful and I think should be condemned across the House? We are, as I said before, Mr. Speaker, committed to tackling all forms of hatred and division, including, of course, Islamophobia in all of its forms. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Which is essentially, we have this movement now to introduce blasphemy laws in the UK. And actually what's happening is the Labour Party are appeasing these ideas. They're not saying, sorry, but we don't have blasphemy laws in this country. And there was a guy, an ex-Muslim from the Middle East, just 2 weeks ago, who burned a Quran in the street in protest. And he was arrested by Manchester police and charged with a racially aggravated crime. So it seems to me like we have all of these kind of extreme things happening. You know, we have over 85 Sharia courts in the UK. We have certain things that to me would be quite simple for a political party to come in and say, we're not tolerating this. We don't have Sharia courts in our country. We don't have multiple systems of law. We don't tolerate these kind of clothing. We don't have blasphemy laws. We have 40,000 Muslims on the terror watch list who are still living in this country. It just seems to me like they say integration, but there's no political will to do so. Like, they actively encourage it because in our NHS, for example, we spend millions and millions on language interpreters for people who live here and don't learn the language. So I'm just wondering, based off everything I've said and kind of this notion of the political will and being brave, because you're gonna get outcry and gasps, and you're gonna get woke politicians, throwing a tantrum. But really, the stuff I'm talking about is what the majority of Britain want to see happen, but they're scared to say it. So like, how do we integrate people, and what do we do about these issues?
So, I mean, it's interesting, the idea of integration. I think that, let me think about this. So maybe we would talk about straight lines. So when the immigration was low, right? So like the 60s and 70s, and that's when everybody started to come and get on the dole, right? British culture, British identity was solid, right? I think now there needs to be some definition. You got to start with what is the definition of being British, right? So I don't know. I'm not sure what that is, but the idea, clotted cream and if anything has the qualifiers of proper and brilliant, you go in that shop, because those are the qualifiers.
And one thing to add just on that is, a report came out just a couple of days ago saying over 50%, I'll put a screenshot on the screen because I can't remember the exact amount, but over 50% of Gen Z people in the UK are not proud to be British. So we have a real shame problem as well on top of that. But yeah, continue.
We do too, here. And so the challenge is like, what is American, or what is British, and so, the mandate, to push back came from, the voting in of Trump. Right. And so, and Trump's, kind of going a little bit too far on the faith-based stuff because we're a religiously free country. Religious freedom is our founding principle. But then he's talking about us being a Christian state, right? That's one of the new statements that he made, which is problematic. But nonetheless, I think the challenge is like, what is the definition of a Brit? And what is Trump here in America is trying to figure out what's the definition of an American, and he's responding to a constituency, right? And so. I worked very, very closely with administration since Clinton. Trump administration was no exception. Trump administration was very engaging to faith communities. I was in the White House a number of times bringing in the Ummah.
Wow.
Well, the first president actually to bring in the 8 makthabs, the eight different sects of Islam, mainstream that represent mainstream Islam, was the Trump administration, and I brought them in, right? So you got this weird sort of thing where he's engaging very thoughtfully. It's never happened before. And I'll give you just a good example is that when it comes to a democratically elected president, their go-to is usually Indian Muslims, right? So Muslims from India. That's where they feel very comfortable with, right? But then they don't listen to the rest of the the Muslim community, you're almost unseen. And then they listen to these well-funded NGOs that are Muslim Brotherhood, right? So it's this weird thing. So they just kind of sole source with what they're comfortable with, but being outwardly, they're saying all this rhetoric, like you're saying. And so I think the challenge is what is British? Is it a Douglas Murray thing? Is it, what he defines as being British? I'm not sure. And so I think if you have a definition of who you are, right, instead of just kind of like letting people know, like, the Britishness is this sort of like ambiguous, amorphous entity that ties back to the past. It's very hard to anchor that in an integration, right? So when I was at the American Islamic Congress, one of our things was integration. One of those things was what do immigrants do? And so I wrote a book about what it means to be American. And so obviously, when I was younger, we had to say the Pledge of Allegiance. We had to obviously speak English and muddle through it. And then we had to do a number of other things we had to do to not demonstrate that we were American, but to integrate into American society. And it wasn't just to pass the citizenship test, right? So there was a qualifier, getting a job. There was a qualifier here, and then get involved with work study programs and so forth. I think that we in America had to have a very good integration program. It's just defunct now because of this wokeness, right? It's like we've got to let people across the border and not participate in the immigration process because they're going through a tough time where they're from.
Yeah.
And so, so if there's no mechanism to get people in process, then, all hell's going to break loose. And that's what's happening in your country, is happening in our country. So
illegal migration, which is, I agree with everything you said. But I mean, in the UK, obviously that's a big problem, but it pales in comparison to legal migration. So we're really doing this to ourselves by design in terms of,
right.
Massive demographic change, very short space of time, vastly different cultures, vastly different values, different languages, different religions, and zero strategy. So, I mean, with some of the stuff I mentioned, specifically with Islam, some of the things we're tolerating, like Sharia courts, I don't know what your view yourself is on stuff like the burqa. I mean, for me, I don't think it should be tolerated in the UK. I think, we have this kind of two-tier system of certain cultures can do certain things, and leftists will be very critical of male violence or gender equality. But if you try and raise concerns with them about, well, can we talk about women in Islam in this country, in certain communities, like how are they viewed? Are they really wearing the burqa as a choice? The list goes on. These notions of blasphemy laws, first cousin marriage, these are all quite specific things I'm talking about. There's a much broader, just general way on how we live our lives and interact with people, and actually don't silo ourselves in. But as in, with the problems we already have with Islam, how do we address that? Because some of the stuff you just said, to me, is basic common sense. And we have some politicians saying that. But when they say you commit a crime, you're deported, we want to close these Sharia courts, they're called far right,
Yeah, I've heard the arguments. It's like, well, if we deport these people, then they die in their country. I'm like, it's like that's not an argument.
We're a member of something called the European Court of Human Rights. And it is essentially the way that the lawyers have started to interpret that law has changed so much over the years that it is near impossible for us to deport pedophiles and rapists. Some of these Pakistani men who are involved in the grooming gangs, there was an article just today that a pedophile could not be deported because it would risk his chance for a family life and to be separated from his kids. It's just absolutely mental. So like that's another example of just the the establishment railing against common sense.
Well, so here's the thing. So it might be sexier to talk about, to anchor this in Islam, right? So what is the Muslim community? What is the British Muslim community doing? right? So that would be my question, right? So I'm Muslim. I in my retirement, which is not a real retirement, but I focus on interfaith engagement because I deal with people. I deal with the highest levels of government. I deal with the Trump, right, for example, and I deal with the White House, and I advocate for Muslims to have a voice. So bringing the Ummah into the White House. I don't define what the issues are, but internally, right, within the Muslim community, I don't really. I try to be very, very explicit and speak with specificity about what Muslim community should be doing internally, right? So here's the question, right? So Piers Morgan, Douglas Murray, very vocal about the rape gangs, the grooming gangs, and all that other stuff. Okay, I have a problem with how they did that, because it's where are they for violence against women normally, right? So that's my angle on them, right? But my angle with the Muslim community is, where is Mehdi Hassan? Right? Where are all these? Where's what are their names? Sadiq Khan and all these other? Where are these guys? Because they know that if you're Muslim and you're transacting violence, and there's, we said we wouldn't get too technical here, but it's in the Quran. If you're transacting violence against women, you're going against the Quran. Period. If you're transacting violence against women, you're going against the Prophet, peace be upon him. So Muhammad, you're going against him. Period. There's hadiths in the Sunnah. It's there. So, in Islam, you have the Quran, you have the Psalms, the Torah, the Injil, which is the New Testament, and then you have, which is a book of sayings, but it doesn't really exist, but it only exists in the Orthodox. And then you have the Quran. Those are the books, right? Every Muslim needs to have them, and read them. Then you have the Sunnah and hadiths. Hadiths are sayings of the Prophet. The Sunnah is how the Prophet lived. Okay, so the Prophet was alive. The Prophet has a number of contacts that he interacted with, and there's a way to verify what the Prophet said and what the Prophet did, because there's testimonies, right? And then there's a process to verify what was real and what isn't, right? And there's some gray areas, but not a lot. But if you look in the Quran, all right, and I wrote an article about this. If you look in the Quran, there's quite a few passages that talk about dignity. There's quite a few passages, right? So that deal with making sure that deal explicitly with sexual violence, right? So Surah Al-Isra, so 1732 talks about unlawful sexual intercourse, right? So we have Surah Al-Nisa, right, which is 419, which talks about you can't compel a woman to do something, right? So I mean, there's and it goes on and on and on and on and on. All right, there's also the hadiths in the Sunnah. There's sayings, and there's the way in which the Prophet lived, where he explicitly was against the mistreatment of women. And so the problem is, and I can send you this, or you can put it in the show notes. There's no Muslims speaking out like this in the UK.
And why is that?
Where are these guys?
That's the question. Is it that they're scared too? Because what you just said is all well and good, but for a non-Muslim person, you can tell them, well, the Quran actually says this, but then when they look at how Islam is playing out in their society, they question, well, is Islam the Quran, or is Islam what I'm actually seeing in front of my eyes? Like how people are behaving, how people are integrating.
Well, to a certain degree, it's not the concern of the outside. So, like, here's the thing. I pulled this up before our conversation, right? So here's the thing. It's like 1 in 4 women. This is UK rape crisis, England and Wales, whatever that is. And so 1 in 4 women have been raped, before they turn 16. This is rape crisis with England and Wales. 1 in 6 children sexually abused. 1 in 18 men have been assaulted. 69,000 rapes, right, since in 2023. So, but this is the interesting part. Who carries out the rape and sexual offenses? 1 in 2 rapes against women are carried out, 1 in 2, by their partner or ex-partner. So 91% of people are prosecuted for sexual offenses are men aged 18 plus, and then 6 in 7 rapes against women are carried out by someone they know. Okay. Your rape gangs aren't the issue. It's terrible, but Muslims aren't the issue when it comes to rape, right? And this is where I have a problem with like Douglas Murray and Piers Morgan. It's like they're when I heard them talking about their rhetoric, they're saying, well, we have a problem. Let's just. I haven't heard them speak out against violence against women or rape before, but when it's Muslims doing it, they're like.
But do they have to? Because they're.
Yeah, because it's a problem.
But I guess
it's a big problem.
From what you just said, and this is what frustrates me about the conversation, because we go from the issue of the rape gangs to talking about general violence against women. But the issue is that sexual assault comes in lots of different varieties and patterns of crime. So yes, you can talk about individual husbands raping their wives. However, we have not seen the organized grooming and gang rape of thousands of girls who are specifically white by Pakistani Muslim men, tortured, branded, covered in petrol, laced with drugs, alcohol, passed among many, many men, also concealed by the community, and specifically being told to the girls, you're a white slag, you're a white whore, telling her because she's not Muslim that she's dirty. So this is the problem in what we've had in this country, is that when you try and talk about the specificities about this phenomenon, for example, talking about the Catholic Church abuse, no one would say, when you say, let's talk about the scandal in the Catholic Church, no one would say, but other people abuse kids too. They would say.
But that's not what I'm saying. So I'm not saying but.
I don't agree that. I don't agree. I think there's other people that commit crimes too, and they are equally worthy of speaking about in terms of solving. But when we talk specifically about the Pakistani rape gangs, that is a very specific type of crime, and we've been unable to speak about it. And I would argue that Douglas Murray and Piers Morgan, I mean, Douglas Murray specifically, obviously, he talks a lot about how Europe is changing, and this is very much tied into that. So I don't think he necessarily. I think the point of this is the rape gangs have come about from a contrasting culture that do not view white women in the same way, and we have brought those cultures into our country. They've abused our girls in the thousands, and then we've not been able to talk about it. So it's not necessarily just, this is a violence against women issue. I think the broader issue is the cultural issue and the immigration issue and the religious issue. So I don't really agree that Piers Morgan and Douglas Murray need to be talking about all types of violence to address this specific issue.
No, that's not what I'm saying. So I'm saying, so here's that. I'm not saying but. It's just to me, it's very funny, right? It's that Pierce and Douglas Murray won't. It appears that they're like, I don't know what, we don't really care about rape that's happening, violence against women that's happening over here. We only care about when it's Muslims, right? So that's a narrative that kind of comes across, right? It's like, let us Brits rape our own women, and that's our own thing. That's our territory. That's how it comes across. All right. So I'm not concerned with that. I'm more concerned with how the Muslim community deals with violence against women. And that's what Muslims for Muslims does. Right. So when I was just talking about this, no imams are speaking out on this. Mehdi Hassan, silent. Right. And you've got British Muslims who are born and raised. Nobody's turning around and saying we need to address this from a Quranic perspective and say that these guys who transacted these violence are now they're on the other side of Islam, because they've violated a maxim. These are the things that need to happen within the Muslim community. It's a struggle on so many levels when it comes to the Muslim community, because there's no central authority. I don't know why any imam or any Muslim leader within the British society has not anchored themselves in the Quran, in the Quranic verses, in the surahs, and the hadiths and the sunnahs, and has addressed this within the community. And that's the responsibility of the Muslim community, the British Muslim community, and the Muslim community, the Ummah as a whole, right? I don't speak for Islam. I'm not, I don't have, I'm not tied to ayatollahs and sheikhs and all this other stuff. But I do speak openly about this. And and just me saying this, right, talking about these stories, it's like kind of opening a door, right? It's like now within the Muslim community, there's this thing called jihad al-jamso, which is the struggle of the tongue, the lie, right? I would say that there's a lie being transacted within the Muslim community to not bring this to light, to not hold those people accountable. I would also argue that
it's just
sorry.
Why do you think that's happening? Because you would think if there's an extreme part of your group and you don't want people to think they reflect you would want to distance yourself from them and condemn them and say, no, that's not what we're about, But so why is it not happening?
Well, it's not. Well, first of all, it's not what the Muslim community is about. I mean, there's not Muslims, the Muslim bands of the Muslim community generally is family oriented. Is generally a collective culture that is governed not only by faith and family, but a larger community that they're integrated in, which is why a lot of violence and stuff like that doesn't happen. When you take someone from a collective culture in an Islamic context out and you dump them in a Western culture, they don't have any of the cultural precepts and cultural norms to guard against bad behavior. And so you're taking somebody from a collective culture in an Islamic context to a Western culture in a Christian woke context, and there's no guardrails. It's the same thing like we were talking about when it comes to driving a car and speeding, right? So if they're unaware of the consequences, or they've been told there are no consequences, and they are creating a collective culture, not an Islamic context, a collective culture in a Western construct, where they're building a territorial, like a gang, a territorial perimeter, then they're going to operate within that perimeter without any of the cultural norms. They're not going to be shamed by their culture. There's not going to be consequences. Their hands won't get cut off or whatever it is. They won't have any of those consequences, right? They won't have a family or tribal feud as a result of this, because they have no ties to that area. So this is what's happening in the UK from someone who understands like the kind of cultural elements of this, is that they're operating like a gang. They're operating outside of their norms, and they don't have the consequences because they're protected by their territorial borders, where the police don't infringe, right? They don't go in. Now, that happened here until the Trump administration. Now, nobody's fooling around, And I live in an upstate New York. I'm a good old boy from the Hudson Valley. I've got a hat that says "Try that in a small town," with an American flag. So we watch after everything. We see what's going on, and it's funny because something very similar happened, but not with Muslims here in Kingston. A bunch of people moved from Portland, Oregon. And I don't know if you know about Portland, but Portland's been very liberal. They've allowed everybody to do whatever they want. So I'm sitting there talking to some people, and they said, God, your parks are beautiful. Your green spaces are beautiful. And I go, yeah. And they go, how come there's no tents on them? And I said, what do you mean? They go, well, in Oregon, there's all these tents, there's a whole tent culture that comes in. And I go, that would never happen here. And they go like, what do you mean? And I go, it would never happen here. I go, first of all, the locals would be marauding around and kicking in tents. We don't tolerate that. The two is that the KPD, Kingston Police Department, would find out exactly what they're doing and what's going on, and that the space, because it's open spaces for everybody. And the third thing is we're New Yorkers, so there's a hefty criminal element that they would not be able or willing to bear as a result of being in an open space with whatever's going on. And so, but they turned around, and the response back to that was, well, that's not right.
Mm.
And I said, who says it's not right? And they go, well, because where we come from, we take care of people. And I go, no, you don't. You don't take care of anybody. You just allow people to kind of plant themselves and defecate in public, and then create a really strange environment where no one can enjoy the park or whatever it is, when it's really everybody's space. And I go, don't bring, you keep that shit on the West Coast. Don't bring it here. And so, why is this happening in the UK? You don't have consequences. These people don't understand. They don't have a perspective. They have no consequences associated with their actions, and they're emboldened by their activities and their leadership within that community. Listen, if you're immigrating to a country, you're not successful from where you come from. Okay. Now what does that mean? That might be because you just need the opportunity, but it also might mean that you're just a dirtbag. And you want to know what? You've exhausted all your opportunities for success, and now you're trying, or for scamming or whatever it is you're going to do, and now you're building a whole new scam. And no one wants to say that about immigrants, right? Just like that guy from Haiti. He can't go back to Haiti because if he goes back to Haiti, he's going to get himself killed because he ran a gang, and the gang was killing a bunch of people. Now he's here and he's raping women, he's killing people, he's doing stuff, and he's got, sky's the limit to him. And he's praising Biden. Now they got caught by ICE. He's like, well, you can't deport me. I'll get killed. The left is saying, well, we can't send him back to his death. And I'm like, why not? So the thing is it's the same thing that's happening with these gangs, right? So again, I'm not saying, but violence against women is a global thing and everybody needs to speak out about it. Yeah, they do. I do think that, why didn't Pierce Morgan call in a Muslim and say, doesn't the Quran say this? Doesn't this go on? Where's the governance within the Muslim community, right? It came across that he was saying, well, we get really appalled when a foreigner does it or a Muslim does it, right? It's not un-Islamic to rape a woman. It's un-Islamic to have transact violence against women. It's un-Islamic to have to not enforce and protect dignity of the human person in Islam. It's in the Quran. There's nothing you can do. You argue with that, you're arguing with the Quran. You're not arguing with me. I don't know why imams haven't said this in the UK. You have a lot of got a lot of scholars a lot smarter than me that know the Quran a lot better than me. I mean, every Ramadan, I'm powering through the Quran as much as I can because you're supposed to read it cover to cover. And sometimes I just get lost. I don't know what I'm doing. But these guys know that it's wrong. They're not holding the community accountable. And what they're doing is that I would intimate that there's probably an imam somewhere that they're listening to in a mosque somewhere that's actually saying, that's giving them safe harbor, at least spiritually. Right. And we all know the bad mosques. We all do. We all know that this one's the Wahhabi mosque, and these guys open up a business and they go there and they, they hate America, but they love generating the revenue, and they all talk bad about America, which is normal, to a certain degree. People can talk bad about the cops and the government, and, everybody has sort of a general malaise of hating, I think bureaucracies. But in this case, I don't see anybody in the Muslim community that's holding the Muslims accountable. Like Mehdi Hassan, right? Big mouth. And he's a Brit, but he's in America. Where is that guy? He has a platform. He could have turned around. He has the same Quran I have. It hasn't changed since the time of the Prophet. He has the same Quran I have. Where are the Quranic verses? He loves fighting with Christians. He loves talking about all his, but when it comes to governing the community that he knows and calling them out and saying you're on the other side of Islam by violating these maxims of in the Quran, he doesn't do that.
And it's the same with Sadiq Khan, our mayor. So Trump recently called him a terrible mayor, and he said nothing in relation to his race or religion, but Sadiq came out and said he is targeting me because of my race and my religion, and he's Islamophobic.
If I wasn't this colour skin, if I wasn't practicing Muslim, he would not come for me. He wasn't coming for me because I'm 5'6", right? He's come for me because of, let's be frank, my ethnicity and my religion. So it's incredibly personal.
Here's a but. Maybe he is Islamophobic, and it's okay to be Islamophobic because people are scared of Muslims. Here's the thing: no one wants to say that. right? Since 9/11, people are afraid of Muslims. And here you have roving bands of rape gangs who are doing really terrible things. And guess what? It's okay to be Islamophobic because of that. But where are the Muslims that are saying these guys on the other side of Islam to stem off, to fight against the Islamophobia? Instead, they're saying in your country, you can't say anything because you're Islamophobic, right? And it comes from outside the community. Where is the internal elements within the community? So sorry to interrupt, but that's the thing that frustrates me so much, because you can't argue against the Quran. And any one of those guys, if they're listening to your podcast or this gets out or whatever it is, you want to know what? We'll put this in the show notes. We'll put one of my articles in the show notes, because it goes through all the stuff. If you violated any of these, you're against the maxims of Islam, you're against the Prophet, and guess what? You're done in Islam. You're done. Which means that, all that stuff about Jannah, all that stuff about the garden, all that stuff, you're done. You're not getting it at all. So here's the problem. No one's saying that in Islam. Sadiq Khan, you want to know what? He perpetrated a crime against Islam, not against Trump, not against this, a crime against Islam by pretending to not know. And he damn well knows the Quran better than I do.
Did you see that clip of him? It was at our London Mayor Assembly. Another politician asked him, do you know the prevalence of these grooming gangs in London? And he just said, I don't know what you're referring to.
I asked you this question last week and you found every which way but not to answer it. Just how many grooming gangs have we got in London?
To avoid any misunderstanding, can she define what she means by that?
Yes, if you look at what's gone on in Rotherham, where there are people taking young girls, grooming them for sex, that is what I'm talking about.
We know in London there are issues about exploitation of young people, but they're not as defined by the member in her definition of what those types of gangs are.
So are you saying we haven't got the same sort of gangs that are in Rotherham, Bradford and lots of other places in the country?
Just for you misunderstanding, what does she mean by that?
You know full well what I mean by that. It's all over the television. You know exactly what I mean by that. These gangs of people that are grooming young girls for sex. Do we actually have those in London?
Today, I'm unclear, Chair, what is meant by the question. If she could spell it out, I can answer.
I've just spelt it out. Are you not listening? It's the sort of gangs that groom young girls at a young age for sex. Exactly how much clearer do you want me to be?
This is after, in January, when Elon Musk blew it up and everything. But so it's after that happened. It's recent.
I haven't seen it.
And then she pressed him 3 more times. She said, we're talking about the grooming gangs that happened in Rochdale, Rotherham, from this community. It was covered up. People weren't able to talk about it. He just said, sorry, I don't know what you're referring to. Like our mayor of London.
Yeah. He first of all, all right, he's lying. Okay, we all know he's lying. And here's the other thing. The second, even if he doesn't know, let's just say you don't know, and it was brought to your attention that his Pakistani community and his Muslim community is perpetrating crime, he's honor bound to step up and step in. Within the construct of an Islamic culture and the construct of even Pakistani culture, he's honor bound to step in. And for him to not do that, he becomes a perpetrator of the violence. Within Islam, it's a collective culture, right? So this is how it works. So I don't understand how anyone could turn around, and this is the problem, right? If you can't operate within the construct of Islam, right? If you don't know the Sharia and Islamic law and how it all comes together, you can't really argue these points well. Right. I can say it because I'm Muslim. I can turn around and say that Pierce Morgan is like, I'm really upset when Muslims rape women, I'm really upset. I can criticize them on that end, but I'm not going to turn around and say, well, as a Christian, you should be doing this or so and so and so on that, because that's not my business. My business is the Muslim community. So from an Islamic perspective, Sadiq Khan is full of it. And here's the thing. It's like, well, then my next question is, are you Muslim? So, because if you're not Muslim, then and you're claiming Islamophobia, or how someone's persecuting you because they're Islamophobic, you're not honoring the faith by stepping in. And he's not just a citizen, he's a government official. So he's now has a sort of second layer of honor, of izat, to step in. You know, I'm Afghan, so they have this thing called izat, right? What's his honor? He has to step in and to make things right. And so he's not doing that because why? He's protecting his community. There's sort of three options here. I'm going to Dennis Murray this because he always boils things down to like these. He's either not Muslim and doesn't know what Islam is. He's protecting his own community, or he just doesn't care. And so here's the problem. Like, now once he transacts one or all three of those things, now he opens himself up, and he can claim Islamophobia, he can claim all this stuff, but he's not acting in good faith as a Muslim. And so the problem is that when somebody cherry picks, and that's the difference between Islam and Christianity. In Christianity, you kind of pick out these sort of verses, and you say, you could say this defines, the entire faith, right? And you can't do that in Islam. Islam is a faith in totality. The Quran is the living word of Allah, is the living word of God. You can't futz around with it. So I can prove that these gangs, if they are Muslim, are violating the Quran and the Prophet. Therefore, they're on the other side of Islam, right? And then that you can tie that group to an imam who's giving them the rhetoric. You can tie them to a imam. So that's a whole nother thing. But here's the thing: maybe Sadiq Khan is going to the same imam. Maybe he's going to the same mosque. Maybe, in a mosque, you'll be sitting here, and then you see a little group of people talking over there. You don't know what they're talking about, right? And so, you kind of muddle through, Jummah prayers and stuff like that. But then, you kind of sometimes wonder who's talking about what and what's going on, and then you go, oh, that guy's a jerk, so they must be the jerk crowd, And so, so you try to insinuate yourself in and say, what's going on here, guys? What's happening? Are we just talking about tea or chai, or are we talking about something else? But if they're talking about something like transacting rape or whatever it is, then you're now honor bound. You can't just walk away and say, I don't want to deal with it. As a Muslim, there is no gray area. It's either right or wrong. We talk about Gaza. Gaza is a really good example. It's the same thing, right? You can't have a doomsday cult run a government. So Hamas is a doomsday cult. You can't have them run a government. If you're a doomsday cult, right, and you're running a government, a doomsday cult is going to do what a doomsday cult does. So doomsday cults in Islam are un-Islamic. It's in the Quran, right? So there's no compulsion in Islam. The children of Abraham should occupy Israel. The children of Abraham, though, does mean Jacob and Ishmael, and then there's like 7 or 8 off-brand other children. So it should be a multi-faith thing, but the Jewish community has just a right to be there just as much as the Muslim community has a right to be there. So that these are things that Mehdi Hassan obfuscates in his conversation, right? So and so, I about marrying cousins, I can't weigh into marrying cousins. I don't know what Islamic law says about that stuff. Although I shouldn't say that. There's very explicit. So Islamic law, when you get married or you,
I guess though it's not like that may not be something to do with Islam, but there is a cultural aspect. Like it correlates with a certain community in Pakistan. So I don't know whether it's just a cultural thing.
It's been addressed in Islam and it's been addressed in Islamic law. See, that's the problem. In a book, if you go to the library or you go to, is it Weathers?
Waterstones.
No, Weatherspoons is a bar. Waterstones, sorry. Yeah, if you go to Waterstones and you pick up a book of Islamic law, any book of Islamic law, you'll see it'll have components, it'll have cases that have been brought. And so the case law will be in the book of Islamic law. And so you could probably find an instance where someone says, can I marry my cousin? And someone has arbitrated over that within, the schools of jurisprudence, right? So it'll say, like, I remember a buddy of mine wanted to marry, his wife passed away and he wanted to marry his mother-in-law. And I was like, but I went into, Sistani has a book of Islamic law, and I went into it and I said, well, it's actually allowed in this case. So you can do it if you wait, 12 months and then get the permission of the family. And that's because books of Islamic law have a lot of case law that was brought to different cases that were brought to someone who arbitrated the law, and like a Sharia judge, right? And they then wrote down the outcomes. So you could probably figure out if they're whatever maktab they're from, Maliki or Jafri or Hanbali or whatever. You could figure out if you figure out where they're from, you probably could figure out if it's permissible. But then it's up to the Sharia courts and it's up to imams to talk about this stuff. And I think that it might be a cultural thing that was allowed when you were trying to build a tribe or preserve the family lineage or whatever, nuances were there. But obviously in a Western country, obviously in this global integrated world, it's probably there's no real good reason.
Well, I mean, the health
unless
consequences are substantial. I mean, to kind of summarize just what you were talking about, I mean, I get the impression that we obviously need both the enforcement from a society to not allow certain behavior, whether that's making certain things illegal or just not tolerating it, but then also the responsibility from within the community as well. So would you say that's obviously what needs to happen? I mean,
yeah, I would say define. I'm a Muslim, so I like specificity.
Well, for
right?
example,
I think that
if we said we're going to ban first cousin marriage, Sharia courts, the burqa, there would be a big pushback from that. But ultimately, I feel like it would be the right decision. I mean,
well, what is Britain? What does it mean to be a Briton? To be a Brit, right? So you have to define that. That's what I'm saying about. So whatever that is, whatever a British citizen is, needs to be defined. And so I think that specificity is really important. And then everybody needs to buy in on that. All right. And the majority has to buy in on that. And because it's a Western construct, right? So that just is what it is. And here's the problem. It's really not that much different than coming from Pakistan or coming from Iran or anywhere else. Brits are a tribal culture. I mean, does anybody know what's going on in Wales? Does anybody know what's happening up there? I don't know. So they've got their own culture in Wales. They got their own culture in Ireland. They got their own culture in Scotland. And so the UK as a whole is a tribal culture, right? What is the tribe of the UK to be British? What does that mean? And it needs to be formalized so that you can create a path for citizenship. It also needs to be formalized to figure out how to enforce, what laws they need to be in place, and what laws need to be changed that are in place, so that we can figure out how to enforce antisocial behavior, whatever that is. So, because I was giggling. I go, no antisocial behavior. So, is it interpreted by the police or people on what is antisocial? When I saw that in air in Scotland, right? I was like, it's so ambiguous and goofy. Because where I come from, it would be like, there's a list of all the stuff you can or cannot do in the pool. Like there's a long list, just a pool, so
that's what we need.
but again, there's no consequences. So there's a lot of people peeing in the pool. So trying to figure out, something that's reasonable, like that list for the pool, doesn't make any sense if there's no enforcement, or the lifeguard that's out there is just there to protect people from drowning and not really enforce anything. And then there's a balance of like, are you really going to have a policeman sitting there on the deck of the pool enforcing that long list of stuff? I don't think so. So that's not reasonable. So having specificity on what is British, what is defined as being British, and then figuring out what is enforceable and what can be enacted in law, I think is really important. If it's left to be interpreted, the funny thing is, it becomes extreme left, not extreme right, when it's left to be interpreted, which is really funny. It's a really, really strange way of looking at things. But what happened is that if you have stuff that's like what's defined as antisocial, what's defined as a hate crime, it becomes interpretive based on what the complaint is and how people feel offended. And that lack of specificity allows for people to go nuts. You're like, I don't even know how many hate crimes I perpetrated in this conversation. I hope not many, but I probably did. Right.
Well, it's
so, you know, and so
it's really refreshing to hear everything you've said, and especially about Sadiq Khan, because I think so many people can't stand him. Yeah, well, I mean, I've really appreciated the whole discussion, JT, and I can't believe how long we've gone on for, but yeah, I think it was really productive, and I learned a lot.
Maybe we'll do 2 shows or 3 shows, you know, maybe, I don't know, but it's a worthwhile conversation. Like the reason why I reached out to you is because you're not a member of my inner circle or community, you know, and you're outside of it. So you are objective and impartial. So we've been building a sort of relationship of interaction, which I think is very healthy. And so I can't say that I'm certainly not a British Muslim as defined by the APBG. But as a Muslim and a member of the Ummah, I would say this is probably a troublesome website when you define things loosely. And I think that you and I struggle with a lot from this, whether it be as a member of the homosexual community, internally and externally, the criticisms. Me too. You know, so we have this sort of shared persecution.
I thought that might be the case. So honestly, I've appreciated it so much. It's been so great. Where can people go and see more of what you do?
So we're Muslims for Muslims with the number 4 between Muslims.org is the website, and I'll send that to you. We also are crossing faces on every podcast platform, and we do a weekly podcast. We just had a really great conversation with 2 Jewish physicists proving God exists using physics and math. Right. So it was just really kind of interesting. Before that, it was Addie, who was a Yemeni Jew, which we were chatting back and forth about her faith journey. But in any event, those are the two websites, and I'll send that stuff. We'll put it in the notes, and I'll include some of this stuff with that we spoke about exploring the Islam sort of stance on sexual violence. And I'd love to revisit any conversation you like. I'll look at this website and maybe we can have a show about APBG, you know.
I'll have to do a little bit more research, but yeah.
You got to be careful. I don't want them I don't want armed response kicking down your door. Like I can imagine that happening. Because it's you know, the problem is if we can't have an honest, thoughtful conversation amongst individuals of different faiths and the same faith, then what are we doing here? You know, we're just being bullied around, and so. But I really appreciate you taking the time and including me in your show. It means a lot.
That's been great. We've talked about so much. So yeah, thank you so much, JT.
Thank you. Yep. Have a good day.